Black Ridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, March-April 1957. The first search was practical. It assumed the men were injured, trapped, disoriented, or delayed by something small that would look obvious once the right flashlight hit it. The mine had a habit of turning minor issues into long hours, and everyone involved believed this would end the same way: tired, annoyed, and solvable. By early afternoon, County Inspector Lewis Hartman requested a full map of Section C. The map was old, marked in pencil, updated by whoever remembered to do it last. Hartman did not complain. He simply asked for the most recent version and accepted what he was given. Search teams moved in pairs, then in threes. They checked air pockets, drainage channels, and the narrow service corridor that ran parallel to the main tunnel. They called the men's names without raising their voices, as if louder speech could agitate the mine. Nothing answered. The second search was procedural. Hartman treated the site like an unsolved equation. He gathered statements, wrote timelines, compared shift reports. He asked the same questions multiple times in different phrasing, not because he suspected anyone, but because he needed the mine to contradict itself. It didn't. Frank Delaney's logs were clean. So were the equipment records. So were the safety checks. So was the output report. At 2:40 a.m., the signal from Section C had been recorded exactly as expected. The notation was brief, 2 marks on a page, yet it carried weight. It meant the system had been alive at that time. The problem was what came after. No alarms, no disruptions, no obvious break. Hartman inspected the exact location where Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, and Joseph Miller were assigned to work. The cut line was started, but not finished. Tools were arranged in their usual spots, not abandoned mid-motion. A jacket hung on a hook where miners sometimes left them if the tunnel warmed up. "Does anyone leave a jacket behind?" Hartman asked. Delaney hesitated. "Not usually." Hartman wrote it down, then wrote a second note beside it. Not usually is not never. On the third day, the search became public. People who had never entered a mine before began forming opinions about it. The town's grocery line became a place for theories. The diner became a place for certainty. Some said the men had left through an old ventilation route that wasn't on the map. Some said the mine had pockets that could swallow sound. Some said something more complicated, then stopped speaking when they noticed who was listening. Hartman ignored speculation. He focused on what could be confirmed. And what could be confirmed was unsettling in its simplicity. The mine was intact. No new cracks, no shifts in support beams, no unusual gas readings, no unexplained water flow. On the 5th day, Hartman requested support from the state, mostly for documentation. A safety coordinator named Miriam Pike arrived with a camera and a calm voice. She photographed the site the way people photograph rooms after someone has moved out. Careful, unemotional, precise. Pike reviewed the logs and asked one question no one else had asked yet. "Why is the mine reopening?" Delaney blinked. "It's not reopening. It's paused." Pike looked past him at the men waiting outside. Paused for how long? No one answered quickly, because the truth was not comfortable. The longer the mine stayed closed, the more people went unpaid. The more people went unpaid, the more the town changed. Black Ridge wasn't just a job site. It was the spine of everything in the valley. Hartman signed an extension for 48 hours, then another. By the end of the second week, The search had covered every mapped passage in Section C twice. Hartman expanded the perimeter to include adjacent routes. Pike reviewed ventilation diagrams from older filings and noted discrepancies. Areas that had been sealed decades earlier, corridors that were supposed to exist but were not accessible. They attempted controlled entry into one sealed route. It went nowhere. In late March, Hartman's report used a phrase that sounded professional but felt like surrender. No conclusive structural explanation. It didn't mean nothing happened. It meant nothing had been found that allowed the county to name it. On April 2nd, 1957, the mine reopened on restricted schedule, not because anyone was satisfied, because the valley had no alternative. Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, and Joseph Miller remained officially missing. Their names stayed on paper with no closure attached. Their lockers remained sealed. Their work positions were not reassigned immediately, not out of superstition, but because management didn't know how to describe the vacancy. When a system cannot describe something, it struggles to replace it. That spring, the town learned a strange lesson. A disappearance wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet enough that the only evidence was what failed to update afterward. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, March 1957. The night shift began the same way it always had. No announcements were made, no warnings were issued. The weather was ordinary for early spring, cold enough to settle into the ground, warm enough to make the air inside the tunnels feel heavy by comparison. At exactly 10:58 p.m., 3 men reported for work. Their names were logged in the ledger by Frank Delaney, the night supervisor. He initialed each entry without looking up, his hand moving from habit rather than attention. Walter Hines, age 42. Raymond Collier, age 38. Joseph Miller, age 29. All 3 had worked the Blackridge Mine for years. None had disciplinary records. None were scheduled for special assignments. They were listed for routine extraction work along the Eastern Tunnel, Section C, for Worth Descent. At 11:03 p.m., they entered the mine together. No one noticed anything unusual about the way they walked in. That fact would later matter more than anything else. The Blackridge Mine did not feel dangerous to the men who worked there. It was old, stable, and predictable. Collapses happened in other places, in other counties, in newer operations that moved too fast. Blackridge had survived because it moved slowly. The mine ran on patterns. Every sound had a meaning. Every delay had an explanation. And that night, nothing broke pattern. At 12:30 a.m., equipment checks were logged as normal. At 1:15 a.m., output numbers matched projections. At 2:40 a.m., a routine signal was recorded from Section C. The system showed activity. At 4 beats a.m., a temporary power fluctuation affected 2 lights in the western tunnel. Maintenance addressed it in under 6 minutes. No alarms were triggered. No evacuation procedures were discussed. At 6:02 a.m., the morning shift arrived. Men gathered near the entrance, exchanging brief remarks, preparing to take over where the night shift would leave off. The process was mechanical, practiced, efficient. At 6:10 a.m., Frank Delaney reviewed the exit log. 2 names were missing, not late, missing. He assumed the explanation before checking the time. At 6:12 a.m., Delaney radioed Section C. There was no response. He radioed again. Static answered. This too was not immediately concerning. Radios failed underground. They always had. Delaney sent 2 men down to check. They returned 12 minutes later. Their report was simple. Section C was intact. Equipment was in place. Work had been partially completed, but no one was there. There were no signs of struggle, no damaged supports, no equipment abandoned mid-use. The tunnel looked like it had been paused. At 6:38 a.m., the mine was closed temporarily. At 7 a.m., county officials were notified. By 9:30 a.m., inspectors began arriving, measured, calm, methodical. They searched the tunnel systematically. Measurements were taken, air quality assessed, everything tested within normal limits. There was no collapse to explain what had happened. By noon, the question had already shifted. Not what happened, but how nothing indicated that anything had happened at all. By the end of the day, the missing men's names were still written in the ledger. They had not been crossed out. No one knew what to replace them with. Black Ridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, April-August 1957. The first paycheck arrived on April 12th. It came on a Friday, folded the same way as every other envelope that week, sorted alphabetically and stamped by the same machine that had stamped it before. No special markings, no handwritten notes. Walter Hines was still listed. Raymond Collier followed. Joseph Miller came last. 3 envelopes, 3 amounts. Exactly correct. Mrs. Hines noticed immediately. She stood in the kitchen longer than usual, envelope unopened, listening to the radio play a morning report that made no mention of Black Ridge. She assumed it was a mistake. Clerical, automatic, temporary. But when she went to the office that afternoon, no one was surprised to see her. "We haven't been told to stop it," the clerk said, apologetic but firm. "Until we are, the system runs." The same explanation was given to the other families. It wasn't indifference, it was procedure. At first, the paychecks felt like kindness, a recognition that something unresolved still deserved consideration. They allowed rent to be paid on time, groceries to be bought without credit, school supplies to be purchased without explanations. People thanked the mine for it. By May, thanks turned into silence. The envelopes arrived every 2 weeks without variance. Taxes were deducted. Union contributions were logged. Insurance premiums were processed as if nothing had changed. When an auditor flagged the accounts in mid-May, the issue was corrected without discussion. The correction did not involve stopping payment. It involved reclassifying the status. Not active, not terminated. Pending resolution, the status sat neatly between categories. In June, a new hire noticed something odd. He was assigned to Section C for training and discovered that the night shift roster still showed 3 extra slots. He asked his supervisor when those positions would open. The supervisor paused. "They're filled," he said eventually. "With who?" the new hire asked. The answer came easily. "The same men as always." The sentence felt true, the way habits feel true. No one challenged it. Underground, something else began to happen. Miners working near Section C reported finishing tasks they didn't remember starting. Equipment showed signs of use that weren't logged. Output numbers from the eastern tunnel remained consistent, even on days when fewer men were assigned there. The explanation, when pressed, was simple. Probably miscounted earlier. Miscounts had become acceptable. By July, the town had stopped asking when the investigation would conclude. The state sent one final letter requesting updates. The response was brief and careful, framed in terms of continued assessment and ongoing evaluation. No follow-up came. The missing men's lockers remained sealed. but dust gathered evenly across all three. No one removed their belongings. No one added to them. They existed in suspension. At a community meeting in August, the mine superintendent addressed production delays unrelated to the disappearances. He did not mention the men by name. He did not need to. Everyone knew who was being avoided. What unsettled people wasn't the possibility that the men were gone. It was the growing sense that the mine was behaving as if they were still present. And when systems act as though something exists long enough, the pressure shifts. It becomes less about explaining absence and more about adjusting to persistence. By the end of summer, Blackridge no longer treated the three missing positions as exceptional. They were simply part of the operation, unresolved but functional. And that created a question no one wanted to answer yet. What happens when a place keeps accounting for people who never came back? Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, November 1958. By the start of 1958, the disappearance had acquired a shape, not a solution, a structure. The records were the first place it appeared. Annual reviews came due in January. Forms were printed, tables prepared, and figures transferred from one ledger to another. The process was mechanical and largely unquestioned. Numbers copied from where they had been to where they were expected to go. Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, Joseph Miller. All three names moved forward. No one paused long enough to stop them. When Eleanor Brooks, a junior records clerk, noticed the entries during a reconciliation check, she assumed an administrative delay. She made a small pencil mark in the margin and flagged the page for review. A supervisor returned it the next morning. The pencil mark had been erased. "Don't correct what hasn't been corrected upstream," he told her. "If it's wrong, someone above us will say so." No one above them did. In March, the mine's insurance provider conducted a routine audit. Adjustments were expected. Questions were prepared. Eleanor watched closely as files were opened and closed. The three names appeared again, quietly embedded in payroll summaries and coverage tables. The auditor frowned once, then kept going. "Pending resolution," he said aloud, as if reading it reminded him of something else he needed to do later. He never returned to the line. By spring, the phrase began appearing more often. Pending resolution. It was applied to tools that required inspection, to routes scheduled for maintenance, to requests that did not need immediate answers. It explained delay without requiring denial. Above ground, production continued. Below ground, something subtler changed. Miners stopped avoiding Section C. At first, it had been an unspoken boundary. No superstition, just discomfort. Over time, necessity reshaped habit. Men were assigned, there again, one at a time, then in pairs. They worked shorter shifts. They logged extra notes. They kept their radios closer. Nothing happened, and that was what unsettled them. Tasks were completed without disruption. Support beams held. Output stabilized. The tunnel behaved as if it always had. The mine did not feel empty. In July, a maintenance report noted that extraction numbers from Section C were slightly higher than projected, despite reduced staffing. The discrepancy was flagged, reviewed, and attributed to improved workflow. No one questioned it further. At a management meeting in August, the superintendent suggested formally closing the open statuses attached to the missing men. "From an administrative standpoint," he said, careful with his phrasing. A representative from the state nodded, but made no recommendation. Closing the statuses would require a conclusion. No conclusion existed, so the statuses remained. In town, people adjusted their language. Families stopped saying when he comes back. They began saying if anything changes. The difference mattered. The paychecks still arrived. Not forever. No one claimed that, but long enough to shift expectations. When reductions eventually came, they happened quietly, transformed into assistance payments, adjusted benefits, redirected coverage. The flow never stopped. The source blurred. In October, Eleanor Brooks resigned. She didn't cite the mine directly. She said she wanted different work, less repetitive detail. But she took none of her notes with her. She left no warnings behind. By November, the annual report was finalized and sent to the county. It listed employment numbers, output totals, safety incidents. The disappearances were not mentioned, not omitted, simply unrequired. And that year, something became clear to anyone still paying close attention. Blackridge was no longer trying to explain what had happened. It was learning how to operate as though explanation wasn't necessary, and systems that make that shift tend not to reverse it. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, January-December 1959. By 1959, the mine no longer closed completely at night. This wasn't an official change. No memo announced it. No policy revised the hours. It happened the way many operational shifts happen, through overlap. One crew finished late, another arrived early. Eventually, the lights were never fully turned off. Continuous operation improved output. That part was documented. What wasn't documented was how the night began to feel different. Men assigned to late shifts stopped referring to starting work. They said they were continuing it. The phrasing slipped in quietly, repeated enough times to feel accurate. Section C was included in the rotation again. At first, assignments there were voluntary. Extra pay helped. So did the absence of problems. Nothing had happened there in 2 years. No one could point to a reason to keep avoiding it. And yet, men noticed things, not events, patterns, equipment that seemed already aligned before a shift began, markings on the wall that weren't part of any current plan, but corresponded to cut lines completed weeks later, chalk symbols that matched the mine's old shorthand, used before several workers had even been hired. Radios crackled more often in that section, but never with voices, just feedback that cleared itself if no one spoke. Supervisors wrote these things down at first. Then they stopped. In April, a night foreman named Harold Quinn filled out an incident log describing activity without attribution. He hesitated over the phrasing, rewrote it twice, and finally handed it in. It came back approved. No follow-up questions were asked. That was when the logs themselves changed. Entries grew shorter. Explanations became vague. Times rounded. The precision that once defined mine documentation softened into suggestion. At the end of one night shift in June, Quinn reviewed the exit count. Everyone assigned to his crew was present, but the equipment totals showed more use than accounted for. He recalculated. The numbers still didn't align. Instead of filing a correction, he did what everyone else had begun to do without noticing. He adjusted the expectation. July brought an internal efficiency report showing that Blackridge's night operations were outperforming comparable mines in the region. Fewer delays, lower incident rates, stable output. The report credited experienced labor and established workflow. No names were mentioned. In August, one miner refused assignment to Section C. Not loudly, not angrily. He cited personal discomfort and requested reassignment. The request was granted without remark. When he asked if his choice would affect future scheduling, the supervisor answered honestly. "No," he said. "Someone else will adjust." And someone did. That same month, the mine's accounting software, recently updated, performed an automated reconciliation across departments. It flagged 3 entries that did not match standard employment categories. The flag cleared itself when no corrective action was taken. September passed quietly. In October, a visiting safety consultant toured the site at night. He remarked on the cleanliness of the tunnels and the efficiency of the workflow. When asked about Section C, he paused, then nodded. "It's always the old sections that teach new ones how to behave," he said. No one asked him to explain. By December, the mine had completed its most consistent year of production since reopening. Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, and Joseph Miller were still listed in archived rosters, carried forward automatically. Their files had stopped moving. They had become reference points. And as the year ended, the mine did something that would have felt unthinkable 2 years earlier. It scheduled night work in Section C indefinitely. No justification was offered. None was required. Black Ridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, January-October 1960. The change did not announce itself. It began with missed dates. A birthday passed without mention. An anniversary came and went quietly. A Christmas card was no longer written, only received. By early 1960, the families of Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, and Joseph Miller had stopped asking the same questions they once asked with precision. Not because answers had appeared, because questions had become inefficient. Mrs. Hines still received correspondence from the mine, benefit statements, adjusted notices, letters carefully worded to imply movement without direction. She read them all, filed them neatly, and stopped bringing them to meetings. There were no meetings anymore. The company had learned how to communicate individually, one letter at a time, one household at a time. No shared space for comparison. Raymond Collier's brother visited from out of state in February. He pressed harder than anyone had in months. "Either he's dead or he's missing," he said at the administrative office. "Which is it?" The clerk, a woman who had not worked there in 1957, answered calmly. "His status is unresolved." That's not an answer. It's the only one we have. By spring, assistance payments were folded into regional programs. Nothing was labeled as compensation. Nothing referenced the mine directly. Support continued, but the source blurred further. People stopped associating the money with absence. Children adjusted faster. Joseph Miller's son stopped asking where his father was sometime in March. He didn't announce the decision. He simply stopped adding the question at the end of sentences. At school, teachers noticed it too. The children affected by the disappearance did not act withdrawn or distressed. They acted normal, adapted. They learned routines without the expectation of change. Psychologists would later call that resilience. Jatun, Black Ridge, it was called growing up. Underground, night shifts continued uninterrupted. By now, Section C felt no different from the rest of the mine. The lighting was stable. The air was consistent. The sounds were familiar. Whatever discomfort had once existed, there had been replaced by routine. That replacement mattered. One miner, Edwin Parker, noted in passing that he felt less alone in Section C than in newer tunnels. He said it casually, as if it were a matter of acoustics. No one challenged the statement. In May, a regional oversight board sent an inquiry requesting confirmation that all unresolved personnel cases had been escalated. The response was sent back within the week. All known cases are under continuous review. The word known did important work. In July, the mine posted an internal bulletin reminding staff that all safety observations should be logged promptly and accurately. After that, logs became even cleaner. By August, the families no longer attended the few remaining public updates. Nothing new was ever said. Nothing needed to be. The disappearance had been integrated. It was no longer an event. It was part of the mine's operational memory, like an old shaft that no longer appeared on maps but still informed the structure around it. When someone new asked about Walter Hines or Raymond Collier or Joseph Miller, they were given the same answer every time. They worked here a long time. No one specified when that time ended. By October 1960, Blackridge had adjusted fully. The families had learned what the mine already knew. Waiting for answers required energy. Living without them did not. And so the questions faded, not because they were resolved, but because the system around them had learned how to proceed without resolution at all. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, February-September 1961. The notice arrived in February. It was brief, formal, and easy to ignore if someone wanted to. A routine state inspection, scheduled months in advance, part of a broader review of older operations across the region. Blackridge was one of many stops. Still, the word inspection carried weight, even after years without consequence. Preparations began quietly, not in panic. Blackridge had learned better than that, but with careful alignment. Paperwork was reviewed, logs were copied, maintenance schedules were adjusted to reflect their best possible interpretations. Nothing was falsified. That was important. There was nothing obvious to hide. The inspector assigned to the site was Arthur Bell, a man close to retirement, with a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on affection for detail. He arrived alone, shook hands without ceremony, and asked for coffee before asking for files. Bell spent his first 2 days above ground. He read slowly. He cross-checked totals. He asked questions that sounded simple but required precise answers. How many men on an average night? How many in Section C? How had that number changed over time? Management answered carefully, not evasively. The assignment varies, one supervisor said. Based on need, Bell nodded. Need has a way of becoming policy. On the 3rd day, Bell went underground. He walked farther than most inspectors bothered to. He lingered in places where nothing seemed noteworthy. He listened more than he spoke. When they reached Section C, Bell stopped. "How old is this part?" he asked. The answer came without hesitation. "Older than most records." Bell smiled faintly. Those sections always remember more than we do. Inside, he observed work quietly. He watched a crew complete a cycle efficiently, without excess motion. He made notes, but did not interrupt. Later, reviewing shift records, Bell paused, at a familiar phrase, pending resolution. He underlined it once, not heavily. That afternoon, he asked to see older files, those from before 1957. The request was met with a moment of uncertainty, then compliance. Boxes were retrieved from storage. Dust was brushed aside. Bell found the original entries quickly. 3 names, 3 dates, no conclusions. He traced the movement of those names forward through the years, watching how they shifted categories without ever resolving. He did not label the process. He did not challenge it. Instead, he asked one final question at the end of the week. Does anyone still expect this to end differently? No one answered immediately. Then a supervisor said, honestly, no. Bell closed the folder. His final report was submitted in September. It cited stable operations, adequate safety compliance, no actionable findings. There was a paragraph near the end that read, certain unresolved matters persist within the administrative framework. These do not currently impact operational integrity. That was the only acknowledgement. No recommendations followed. After Bell left, the mine continued unchanged. Whatever risk the inspection once represented faded into paperwork and time. For the first time since 1957, Blackridge understood something clearly. External oversight depended on visible disruption. Blackridge no longer produced any. By the end of 1961, the mine had outlived scrutiny, not by resisting it, but by giving it nothing concrete to oppose. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, March-December 1962. The decision did not come with a meeting. There was no announcement, no vote, no visible acknowledgement that anything important had changed. It arrived the way many decisions do after years of delay, through paperwork that no longer felt connected to the thing it represented. In March, a staffing form was updated. 3 positions in Section C were marked as available, not reopened, not replaced, available. The distinction mattered to whoever wrote it. The posting went up quietly on the internal board. There was no mention of why the roles were vacant. There hadn't been for years. The mine did not reassign the numbers attached to the jobs. It reused the categories instead. When new hires filled the shifts, their names were appended. Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, Joseph Miller, and beneath them, acting assignment. The old names remained. The new ones hovered below. No one commented on the format. The men hired to work those shifts were younger than their predecessors. They had less experience, more willingness. They accepted the assignments without asking about history, because nothing in the paperwork invited them to. The mine trained them efficiently. They were shown where to stand, what to listen for, how long to pause before moving equipment, what counted as a normal sound, and what did not require attention. They adapted quickly. By May, the output from Section C increased slightly. Not enough to trigger review, but enough to register improvement. Management attributed it to fresh labor. The explanation fit. Underground, the new workers noticed familiar things for unfamiliar reasons. They followed markings on the wall that no one claimed responsibility for. They aligned tools the way they had been shown, even though no one remembered the origin of the technique. Routine absorbed uncertainty. That summer, one of the new hires, Paul Ritter, age 24, found a jacket behind a support beam. It was old, clean enough to have been stored properly, too large to belong to him. He brought it up to a supervisor. The supervisor examined it briefly, then folded it. Lost property, he said. Put it in storage. Ritter hesitated. How long has it been there? The supervisor answered without irritation. Longer than we track those things. The jacket joined others. In July, payroll finally changed. The familiar envelopes stopped arriving at 3 houses. Not abruptly, gradually. A delayed deposit here, an adjustment there, benefits reclassified, coverage expired. no letter announced the end. By the time anyone noticed, there was nothing to appeal. The families adjusted the way they had learned to, quietly, internally, without public confrontation. Support had thinned slowly enough to avoid rupture. In September, school enrollment forms were updated. Emergency contact fields were simplified. Certain names were removed, not crossed out. Removed. By the end of the year, new employees occupied all 3 shifts full-time. The mine's internal language changed one last time. The phrase pending resolution vanished from active documents. It remained in archives, but no longer traveled forward. Resolution had occurred, not through discovery, not through explanation, through replacement. That year, Blackridge finally completed the administrative process it had delayed since 1957. And in doing so, it did something important. It confirmed that absence did not require answers to be settled. Only time long enough for systems to move on without them. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, January-November 1963. Replacement did not erase memory. It changed where memory lived. By early 1963, the mine's paperwork had stabilized. Staffing levels normalized. Payroll aligned with expectations. Reports no longer carried unresolved language. From the outside, Blackridge appeared complete again. Underground, something persisted. Not incidents, not disruptions, patterns. New workers in Section C began adjusting their pace without instruction. They slowed at specific turns. They paused before certain equipment checks, even when no hazards were present. Radios dipped into static at the same intervals every night, always clearing if left alone. No one filed reports about it. By now, the mine had taught everyone which observations required documentation and which belonged to experience. In February, Paul Ritter noticed something else. The cut lines near the eastern wall followed an older geometry. Precise, efficient, unfamiliar to modern training guides. When he asked who had taught that method, his trainer shrugged. That's how it's always been done here. Ritter checked older manuals later. They didn't match. In March, a ventilation assessment showed consistent airflow improvements in Section C, despite no recorded upgrades. Engineers recalculated 3 times and accepted the numbers. The mine behaved as if it remembered adjustments no one had logged. That spring, a former worker named Samuel Ortiz visited after 10 years away. He walked the tunnels with familiarity that surprised even him. When he reached a junction near Section C, he stopped. "This used to be louder," he said. "What do you mean?" asked a supervisor. "More voices," Ortiz replied, then smiled awkwardly. Probably just memory. No one corrected him. By June, management noticed something subtly beneficial. Crews trained in Section C made fewer errors elsewhere. They anticipated shifts before instructions were issued. They corrected inefficiencies without formal review. Section C was producing better workers. That observation did not make it into any report. In August, a wall marking was discovered behind newer reinforcement. Faded chalk. 3 initials, repeated once. WHRCJM. No date accompanied them. The discovery was logged as graffiti and scheduled for removal. When the crew returned the next week, the markings were gone. No one remembered erasing them. In September, a minor cave-in occurred in a newer section of the mine. No injuries. Repairs were swift. Several workers remarked that it felt like the wrong place for a collapse. "Section C holds better," one of them said. He had been hired 5 years after the disappearances. By November, Blackridge had completed one of its safest years on record. Safety briefings emphasized shared responsibility and situational awareness. They didn't mention history. They didn't need to. The mine functioned with the confidence of something that had already absorbed loss. What no one acknowledged openly, but many sensed privately, was this: Blackridge did not feel like a place that had forgotten. It felt like a place that had incorporated what it lost into how it worked. Memory didn't remain in stories or files. It remained in timing, in spacing, in expectation, and that made it invisible. Because systems that remember without speaking about it don't appear haunted. They appear refined. Blackridge Mine, Logan County, West Virginia, January-December 1964. The closure was not dramatic. There was no collapse, no warning siren, no sudden disaster that required explanation. The mine closed the way many long-lived operations do, gradually, under the language of economics rather than necessity. In January, a market report noted declining demand. In March, a maintenance review recommended deferring upgrades. By June, the decision was framed as inevitable. Blackridge would finish the year, no extensions planned. The announcement was met with resignation, not protest. The mine had been preparing people for years without telling them it was doing so. Workers adjusted schedules, families made plans, equipment orders were cancelled without panic. Underground, nothing changed at first. Section C continued operating through the summer. Output remained steady. Crews worked with the same quiet efficiency that had come to define the place. In August, Paul Ritter finished his last shift there. He paused longer than usual before exiting the tunnel, standing near the eastern wall, where the old cut lines ran straight and true. He did not feel watched. He did not feel alone. He felt completed. In September, decommissioning began. Sections were sealed systematically, mapped, reinforced, closed. When crews reached Section C, they followed the protocol precisely. Supports were installed, barriers set, final checks logged. One small anomaly appeared in the records. The total hours attributed to Section C exceeded the combined logged hours of assigned crews by a small but persistent margin. The discrepancy was noted, recalculated, and then ignored. It did not affect the closure. By October, the last equipment was removed. The lights were shut off one by one, leaving only emergency systems active. On the final night, the skeleton crew performed a walkthrough. Nothing unusual was reported. No sounds, no movement, no unfinished work. On November 28, 1964, Blackridge Mine officially ceased operations. The ledger was closed. The final document listed decades of production totals, safety incidents, employment figures. The disappearances from 1957 were mentioned once, in a footnote referencing unresolved historical matters with no outstanding obligations. No conclusions were attached. The building was locked, the valley quieted. In December, snow covered the access road. Wind erased tracks. Nature did what it always does when structures stop insisting on permanence. Years later, people would speak of Blackridge the way people speak of places that shaped them, with familiarity, without urgency. Some remembered the men who didn't come back. Most remembered the mine. And that distinction mattered, because the shift didn't end when Walter Hines, Raymond Collier, and Joseph Miller vanished. It ended when the system that accounted for them finally shut down. No answers were found. No explanations surfaced. No conclusions demanded belief. Only this remained. The mine had continued long enough to prove something quietly unsettling. That absence does not always interrupt function. That systems can adapt to loss without acknowledging it. And that sometimes the most enduring consequences are not what disappears, but what keeps working afterward. Blackridge didn't collapse. It didn't fail. It didn't get an answer. It simply stopped. The men who never came back were never found. No report ever explained where they went. No document ever closed the question the way people expect questions to be closed. And yet, the mine kept working. For years, it adjusted. It accounted. It adapted. Not around the truth, but around the absence of it. The paychecks arrived. The schedules remained full. The tunnel stayed productive. Until one day, there was nothing left that needed explaining. That's the part worth sitting with. Not the disappearance itself, but how quickly a system can learn to function without resolving it. Because once something continues long enough, people stop asking what it costs to keep it going. Blackridge didn't erase the past. It absorbed it. And when the mine finally closed, nothing was solved. Nothing had to be. Only one thing was proven, quietly and without witnesses. Sometimes the end of a story isn't when something happens. It's when nothing does, and everyone moves on anyway.